What do you think, Becky?
Let's do this.
You do this thing? Okay. Hey, everybody. If you would be so kind, it would be awesome to be able to see some of your faces. If you're in a place and you're comfortable turning on your video, we do want this to be an interactive session. So if you're not comfortable, that's totally fine. But if that's possible, we'd love to be able to see your faces. This event is a News You Can Use session from the Office of Legal Services Innovation at the Utah Courts. We have Dr. Rebecca Sandefur, who's here representing the office, and I'll give her a longer introduction in a moment. The other sponsor for this session is Justice Lab, which is a legal clinic that I direct at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And what we'd like to do is to get started with intros, but what I had planned I cannot do unless I can see people on video. So I will I'm looking at some of the names, and I wanted to give us all a sense of who is in the room. And it looks like we have some law students, some professors from the university, some lawyers from the community. If anybody wants to pop into the chat, any folks who I might have missed, if you have an identity group or a role that you want to identify that I might have missed, please feel free to do so. Okay, hello to everyone who just joined. We're just doing some brief introductions. And what I want to ask something of all of you right now to get us started. I want to ask you to take a minute and think to yourself about one thing, just one thing, the first thing that comes to your mind that you want to get out of this conversation. And I want to ask everyone to write that one thing in the chat. And we're going to take like a minute and a half to do that. So the question is, what's one thing you want to get out of this conversation? Please tell us in the chat and feel free to send it to everyone. I really should have set this up with Jeopardy music. Failure Town. All right, we've got Jency. Jency wants to know more about the Sandbox. Helen wants to know a sense of agency in the topic. I'm not sure what that means, Helen. Sense of urgency? Oh, sense of agency, like you want to have a better understanding, maybe? Correct me if I'm wrong, Helen. Okay, cool. Gotcha. How to engage with the regulatory sandbox and partners as a research team. Scott's looking for Sandbox information. Carrie, who I know is a non-lawyer, who's a policy advocate, is interested in how do we advocate for people's needs. Others. Arul wants to know about efforts from the legal community to increase access to justice. Arul is also a non-lawyer. She's a researcher who's at the business school. Any others? Okay, we've got Hillary wants to know more about the Sandbox and how to reach people who need legal help and don't know how to ask for it. Well, the good news is we have our key speaker today is Dr. Rebecca Sandefur, and she is one of the leading experts in the country, and many would argue in the world, in access to justice. She is housed at at Arizona State University. She was recently awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship for her work in civil justice research, and she is also part of the staff of the Office of Legal Services Innovation. And to be clear, that office is the regulatory entity that oversees the Sandbox, and I'm sure Dr. Sandefur will talk more about that. So I think it's important to understand that Dr. Sandefur is a sociologist by training, so she's an academic, but she's devoted a large part of her career to a very practical and pragmatic and important task, which is helping lawyers, judges, and justice system actors, like all of us, understand how real people experience civil legal problems and how they interact with and think about justice systems and legal services. There's truly no one who knows more about the US civil justice system than Dr. Sandefur, and also about how real people experience it. She also knows how to translate complex research subjects into plain language, which is a skill set that we'll be leveraging today. And she's going to share with us in a really concrete way what decades of research have to say about how legal services providers, lawyers, and others can most effectively find and capture the attention of people who need legal help. So one last thing, that I'm going to be quiet. I want to give you some rules of the road. We want this to be an interactive conversation. That's one of the reasons I asked you to turn on your videos if you would. And so we would love, Dr. Sandefur would love it if you would interrupt her. You can interrupt her by speaking if you're brave enough to do that. You can raise your little blue Zoom hand. You can raise your actual physical hand. I'll sort of try to moderate and catch people if Dr. Sandefur doesn't see you, and I'll call on people who raise their hand. You can also put a question in the Zoom chat feature, and I'll be monitoring that and sort of grabbing those questions, maybe calling on you to ask your question and kicking those to Dr. Sandefur. Questions, concerns, edits before we get started? Okay, Dr. Sandefur, take it away.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Anna, for that introduction. And thanks for taking time out of your Friday afternoon, a holiday Friday afternoon, I would like to point out, to listen to somebody talk about research. I think that's pretty impressive. I'm going to share my screen here, if I can find what I want. There we go. So I want to talk about two things. One is what research tells us about how ordinary people think about and experience their justice problems, because that gives us some information about entry points to connect with them. And then I want to discuss some of the different innovations, mostly around America, but also around the world, that people have developed in order to make these kinds of connections. And some of them are going to be possible in the Sandbox in a way that they weren't pre-Sandbox. So just to kind of set the stage, we know that every year Americans experience millions and millions of civil justice problems, and that's true around the nation, and it's true here in Utah. And these problems fall in core areas of life. So if you look at a recent survey for the United States that was done by the World Justice Project, you've got 30% of the folks in this survey reporting at least one consumer problem. You've got about 32% reporting a problem with money and debt. People have housing problems. People have problems with their jobs. People have issues surrounding family. These are all issues that if they don't get resolved in a proper, lawful, effective, timely way, can really derail people's lives. And Utah looks very similar. So last year, the Utah Bar Foundation did a survey of lower income households. I think their definition of that for the purposes of the survey was 200% of poverty or below. And you see that the kinds of problems that people have in Utah mirror the kinds of problems that people have around the country. So they have problems with money, with employment, with housing, with their health insurance and access to health care, and with different kinds of family relationships. As far as we know, these problems are very impactful. So that World Justice Project survey asked people who reported a justice issue. And the really important thing about this style of survey is it doesn't expect people to know anything about the law. So the way it asks questions is it says, are you 3 or more months behind on your rent? Or does your employer owe you overtime or other wages that you're not being paid? So they talk about the specific circumstance that happens to be justiciable, but they ask it in a way that doesn't require you to know that there are perhaps legal remedies or that you have legal responsibilities in that issue. And so if you ask people who report one of those situations around housing, around family, around work, around benefits, around healthcare, as part of this or as a result of this, did any of these things happen? You see these problems can be really impactful. So almost 20 million problems are related to negative health outcomes, physical health, mental health, stress-related ill health. About 18 million cause you to lose something important and material that lets your household or your life move forward. So they involve lost income or lost employment or lost housing. Lots of these problems, almost 14 million, involve damage to important relationships. And then almost 5 million of them, people felt that they had contributed to problems that they were having with alcohol or drugs, so to substance abuse issues. Another way to think about how impactful these problems are is to calculate how many years an average person will spend dealing with civil justice problems or dealing with these kinds of hardships of health outcomes, lost income, and so on as a result of civil justice problems. And a colleague and I did some estimates, and if you look at Americans in midlife, they can expect that about 2/5 of the rest of their lives, they'll be experiencing at least one civil justice problem. Housing, health, money, so on. And then if you look at people who are sort of early to mid-adulthood, they can expect to spend about 1/5 of their future lives, however long those lives are, dealing with hardships that are created by civil justice problems. Those things at the top of the slide, health outcomes, lost income, damaged relationships, and so on. So these are very impactful events. We know that most of them get no legal service of any kind. And that's part of the goal of the Sandbox is to open up a space where new kinds of services can be developed that might allow people to connect in more effective ways than they can now. So for the United States, we estimate that there are about 150 million new civil justice problems every year, and most of those get no legal service of any kind. The same story is true for Utah. So Utah has about 2.7 million people. If you use these estimates for the state of Utah, you've got about 1.5 million new civil justice problems every year. And just like in the rest of the country, most of those get no kind of legal service at all. So if you think about the experiences of ordinary people with civil justice problems, it's kind of like an iceberg. And so right now, the tip of that iceberg are the clients that are currently getting some kind of legal help with their justice problem. And that's a tiny portion of all of the justice activity. It's somewhere between 11 and 25%, depending on how you want to estimate it. But then there are all these other people who have real problems and are real people and could be benefiting from services and could be, if you're thinking about it from a business model perspective, could be your clients, could be buying things from you. And so part of the goal of the Sandbox is to change the shape of this iceberg so that more of it is surfaced up to the top. The research that we have has shown us some surprising things about why people don't get legal help for legal problems. And one of the most important ones is that they don't recognize the legal aspects of justice problems. So to take the wage theft example, people don't think of wage theft as a violation of wage and hour laws. They often think of it as a personal failing in the person who's not paying their wages. My employer is a jerk, right? So many problems emerge in relationships with other people, and that's often where people make the attribution, rather than saying there's some order that I could bring in to take action on this problem. And one way to see how people think about their justice problems is to say, okay, so you've told me your employer's not paying you overtime, or you've told me you're 3 months behind on your mortgage, or you've told me you're thinking about getting out of this marriage. What kind of problem is that? Is that a personal problem? Is it a moral problem? Is it a legal problem? Is it bad luck? Is it just a part of life? And if you do that, you see something really striking, which is that the most common way that people describe their justiciable problems, that is things that are actionable under the civil law, is as either bad luck or part of God's plan for them. So these are either things that just happen to you because stuff just happens, or they're supposed to happen to you. And if this is just stuff that happens, or it's supposed to happen to me, I'm probably not going to file a lawsuit about it, or try to get help with it, or perhaps even do anything at all about it. Did someone say something? There's another chunk of problems that people describe in a way that suggests they think that maybe somebody should be involved, but not third parties that are not known to them. So there's about 1/5 of problems that people describe as private problems. There are problems. This is our family's problem, our community's problem, it's my problem. So maybe somebody should do something about it, but maybe not somebody who I don't know, who isn't a part of us, however I define us. And then it's really a minority of justice problems, that is, of events that are governed by the civil law that people describe as legal, that they understand to have legal aspects. And so this sort of framing of the issues of daily life that people run into plays a big role in where they go for help and whether they seek help at all for these kinds of problems. We know that when people seek help when they're in trouble, they really like to go through trusted sources. And one way to see this is to ask people who've had some kind of justice problem, what did you do about it? Did you do nothing about it? Did you try to handle it on your own? Did you go to your immediate social network, so your family and friends, or did you go outside that to some kind of third party, to constituent services for an elected official, to a lawyer, to a city agency, to a community organization, to your church, whatever? And what you see is that most people handle justice problems on their own. That's a pretty trusted, I trust myself a great deal, right? So that's a trusted source of help. If they go outside themselves to someone else, the first place they go is family and friends, so their immediate social network. And then about a fifth of problems ever make it out to some kind of third party that's not part of that immediate social network. So people go, they start with people who they already know, with entry points that they already trust, and they move, and they may stop there, or they may move out from there. And that's an important piece of insight if you're trying to connect with them. One of the things that's really interesting is once people decide, okay, I'm going to go find legal services, which outside the sandbox means I'm going to go find a lawyer, right? You would think that the internet would have dramatically changed the way people find specific providers. And it has changed to some extent, but it's still the case that the most common way that people figure out what specific lawyer or what specific provider can help them is by a personal recommendation from someone else, right? So they go to a trusted source and ask that person, who should I go to or where should I go when I have this particular problem? And that's just as true now as it was 30 years ago. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind. The technology and the internet have changed things in really powerful ways, but they haven't changed the fact that people go through trusted sources for help when they're in trouble. The other thing that's we've discovered in doing this research over the past 2 or 3 decades is that people often think that they're doing what makes sense, and oftentimes they're right, and sometimes, unfortunately, they're wrong. One way to sort of see how they think about why they should do or not do what they do or don't do is to say, okay, you told me you had this problem, this problem with not being paid overtime, this problem with not being able to get your veterans benefits. And you also told me you didn't get any help with that problem from anybody outside your family and friends. Why didn't you go for help? And so, did you not go for help because it was too stressful? Did you not go for help because you didn't know what to do? Did you not get help because you thought it would be too expensive? Or did you not get help because you thought there wasn't any point in getting help because it wouldn't make any difference? Or there wasn't any point in getting help because you didn't need any help, right? You understand the situation and what to do. And when you frame it to people this way, you get some very interesting results. So there are some people, or there's some situations where people are frightened or stressed out by the situation, and that keeps them from acting. And there are some situations where people don't know what to do, and that keeps them from acting. When I started this research, we all thought the reason people didn't get lawyers for their justice problems was because they were sitting around thinking to themselves, I'd love to have a lawyer, but lawyers are just so expensive. And there is a certain less than a fifth of problems people say I didn't get any help because I thought it would cost too much. But the much more common reasons that people don't go for help are that they either sort of resign themselves to the situation and believe it wouldn't make any difference to get help, or that they completely understand the situation and they know what's possible and what's not possible, and they're doing it or not doing it, and they've figured out how to handle it. And again, sometimes they're right about these judgments, and sometimes they're not right. And what you want to do if you're a service provider, whether it's for-profit or not for-profit, is find those people who misunderstand the needs for that they need to be inactive, right? Who misunderstand that there's nothing that can be done. The other thing that some more contemporary research is showing us is that when people are in these situations and they're looking for help, they want transparency and clear understanding of what's going to happen. Some of you who have law practices out there may be familiar with a company called Clio. So Clio makes law practice management software, but they also every year put out a really interesting legal trends report that includes surveys of different business practices of law firms, but it also usually has some kind of survey of consumers of legal services. And in 2019, their trends report asked consumers of legal services, when you're making a choice between different providers, what's important to you? And you see that clarity and transparency and timeliness are really, really important to people. So People want to know, over 75% of people want to know, how much is this going to cost? Even more people want to know, 80% of people want to know, what are my next steps? How is this going to move forward? People want their questions asked, not just some of them, but all of them. And people want this in a timely fashion. And so, this is about transparency and clarity and responsiveness. Those are really important to people once they've decided to seek help and are choosing where to go get it. So you end up in a situation where this, creates some challenges for people and organizations that are trying to connect with consumers and clients, but it also creates some opportunities. So people prefer to seek help through trusted sources. So where are those and how can you embed in them? People don't connect their justice problems to law or to legal solutions. So how can you connect to the problems the way they understand them? And particularly when people are in situations that are uncertain and they don't know what's going to happen, they work best with information that's targeted to what they're experiencing as they experience it.
Hey, Becky, Dr. Sandefur, can I jump in real quick with some on-point questions from the chat?
Absolutely.
So we have some questions. I'm going to kick two to you. So one, they're both about help-seeking behavior. One is about the reasons why people do what they do. So Ben says, basically, do your data suggest that people assume lawyers are more useless than expensive? And I knew you would love that question, which is why I asked it first. So that's question number one. Is it that people believe lawyers are more useless than expensive? Question number two comes from Arul and from Carrie Butler, which is a question about demographics, socioeconomic profiles, and how that relates to help-seeking behavior.
So those are both great questions. What I would say about whether people think lawyers are more useless than expensive, which I think is just a lovely framing of the question, is that people are for the most part not thinking about lawyers at all, right? So they're not affirmatively thinking of them and saying, oh gosh, that would be useless. They're thinking about the problem as they experience it in their lives, and lawyers are usually not on the radar screen. If you look at surveys, public surveys of like trust in the legal profession, I mean, trust in all professions is at a low ebb for reasons that you can see around you, but they're not. It's not particularly bad. So it's not that people necessarily have a bad opinion of lawyers. It's that they don't think of lawyers as a place to go and develop opinions about lawyers when they face these kinds of problems. And then the second question was about the demographic differences in the way people handle and respond to problems. And those are really great questions. One thing that you see in the US context is that a few years ago, I was really interested in this phenomenon of people doing nothing about really significant justice problems, and why would you do nothing? Poor people in the United States are much more likely to do nothing than people who are not poor. And so I did some focus groups to try to understand why that was. I had focus groups with low-income people and focus groups who would be legal aid eligible, and then focus groups with people who were moderate income and low moderate income. And one of the things that was really striking was certainly there are people who tell stories about doing nothing about a justice problem because they're embarrassed. So debt is one where shame plays a big role, or where they're afraid of retaliation or of the consequences of taking action. But one of the things that you saw particularly in the low-income focus groups, when people are telling stories about how they handle different situations in their lives, is something that at that point I called resigned frustration. So people are actually pretty efficacious. That is, they try to do things that make sense to them around the issues that they have. But poor people are likely to run into bureaucracies and systems and organizations that are totally oversubscribed, that are not particularly responsive to public concerns. And so they try to solve different kinds of justice problems, and it's very time consuming, and sometimes it takes you nowhere. And so they learn over time, this is not going to be worth it. I'm never going to get to a good result of this. And that experience isn't evenly distributed across the population. So I think that plays a big role. But I want to talk about another finding. So I compared that difference between the rates of doing nothing between the poor and the not poor in the US to the rates of not doing nothing between the poor and the not poor in the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom is a great comparison if we're thinking about the sandbox, because just like in the sandbox, two things can happen in the United Kingdom. Non-lawyers can give legal advice, and entities that are not law firms can produce legal services. And so what you see is that in the UK, everybody is much less likely to do nothing because there's so many different entry points into getting help. There are well signposted national advice services. Some of them are just legal advice in general. Some of them are for specific problems like homelessness or specific populations like the elderly. There are ombudsmen for major regulated industries, so like financial services, telecommunications. And if you have a problem with your cell phone provider, who does not have a problem with their cell phone provider, you can submit a complaint to this agency and it independently investigates. You're done once you submit the complaint, and then it produces a binding decision. And the decision is actually binding on the organization, but you can still file a lawsuit if you want to. Now, why would organizations agree to this? That's crazy, because they can outsource their complaint function to the government and have the government handle all of these little issues that are big niggling things for them. So it's not just about the individual capacities of people, it's about the institutional opportunities that are available to them to use their individual capacities. And part of the idea of the sandbox is could we create a new ecology where people with different capacities could be more effective at thinking about how they might act on their own issues.
Great. So I want to flag for the group that I'm going to ask Dr. Sandefur in a minute to explain what the sandbox is and then give some examples of concrete things that might be in it. But I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about this help-seeking behavior question, because we have another question about it, and I have the instinct that folks may have follow-ups about sort of the demographic, socioeconomic questions. So feel free to post those, raise your hand, interrupt. But one I want to pose to you, Dr. Sandefur, comes from Carrie, which is, can you tell us anything about actual problem resolution? So, and in particular, Carrie was curious about if people are reaching out to friends and family, like, does it work? And one thing that she suggested was, are our family members paying for legal representation? Are they helping them fix the issue in some non-legal way, like going and talking to the neighbor whose dog bit your dog? What about all that?
So that's a great question. And friends and family are so sometimes they take action on your behalf, right? They go try to deal with the government agency that's causing you a problem or the neighbor whose dog bit your dog. But sometimes, and this is the interesting thing about justice, recognizing that justice problems emerge as part of life. They're just a natural part of life that happens to be institutionalized as something that could be acted on legally. Sometimes they just solve the problem. So if the problem is, I don't have enough money to pay my rent, and you loan me, my aunt, $500, that solves my problem, right? It solves my justice problem of being in breach of my lease. And so people's, what kind of assistance you're able to get, though, depends upon the resources of what you can reach to. So can you reach to people who have money that they can share with you if it's an issue that's about money? Can you reach to people who know about what the formal solutions are or not? And the research that we know on that is that as people move into professional jobs, they're more likely to connect problems to law, not so much because you learn in school that things are legal, but because you know lawyers, because they're hanging out in the same places you're hanging out, and because your job makes you have to know about law. So you get trained in anti-discrimination law trainings, you get trained in anti-harassment trainings, and so the world that you're in is giving you more of those opportunities to make that connection than somebody else's job or social network might give them.
Awesome. Feel free to interrupt with any follow-ups on that. I think, so Dr. Sandefur, I think one question that I think that we've gotten that's on the table is what the heck is the sandbox and what might be in it? But I think you have a choice about whether you want to address that now or sort of finish talking about the research and then talk about the sandbox, and I'll leave that to you.
Well, I think I'll just say a little bit about the sandbox, and there will be a future event like this that is focused entirely on the sandbox and how to apply. But the sandbox is it's a controlled regulatory experimental space where entities that could be for-profit entities, they could be not-for-profit entities, can apply to produce and deliver legal services to the public under relaxations of the current rules about the unauthorized practice of law. So non-lawyers can practice law in the sandbox, and computer programs can practice law in the sandbox. And under relaxation of the rules about who can own and profit from the production of legal services. So you can release the fee sharing rules, you can release the non-lawyer ownership rules. And entities, if you want to do this, you apply. The application is on the website for the Office of Legal Services Innovation. And what the application asks you to reflect on and provide information about are the regulatory principles that govern the management of the activity in that sandbox, in this experimental space. So the principle of regulation is only consumer protection. This is the only thing the sandbox is trying to do in terms of its regulatory actions. And it's focused on monitoring 3 different harms. So one is the possibility that somebody gets an inaccurate or inappropriate legal result to their justice problems. The possibility that they miss out on a right due to ignorance or because someone gives them terrible advice. And the possibility that they buy an inappropriate or unnecessary legal service. So upselling would be one example of that. And when entities apply to enter the sandbox, the office assesses the risk level. And so the logic of that is sort of how far does this depart from the traditional practice of law? So I don't have a law degree. And if I applied to enter the sandbox and I said, I would like to provide trust and estate services to people with high value estates. I know nothing about that, right? I would have to make some plausible case that I had something that was of value, but that would be really high risk because that would be a non-lawyer providing a legal service where there's a lot at stake, right? And so then you're reporting, whereas you know, if you want to have a small investment by non-lawyers in your firm, that's a much less, and the firm is still controlled largely by lawyers, that's a much less risky thing if you're thinking about departure from traditional legal practice. And so then the monitoring that the sandbox does is based on that risk assessment. So if you're a low risk entity, you have to report a few facts about what you do quarterly. And if you're a higher risk entity, say you're a moderate risk entity, you have to report more facts about what you do on a monthly basis. And that includes so if you have if something that's not a lawyer or something that's not controlled by a lawyer is providing a legal service, it's common that the office will ask that the first 20 cases processed by whatever that service is are audited by a legally competent person to see whether the service is producing the right outcome, right? So avoiding those three harms. So you apply, the risk level is assessed. There's a lot of usually communication back and forth between the office and the entities to get to the point of coming in. And then once you come in, you produce your services and the office it monitors these data and looks for indications that something's going badly. We just started receiving, the first entity started working on October 1st. So we'll have our first month of data at the beginning of November, and then we'll start to implement that process. So I hope that's sort of the basic outlines of how it works.
Yeah, and your outline actually prompted a sort of more detailed follow-up question that I'll have 2 questions. So one is, do you have a sense of what the date is for what is the Sandbox event, or should folks just sign up on the newsletter on the homepage, which I posted in the chat?
We're aiming for late January.
Okay, great.
That's the idea.
So for everyone, in case you didn't see it in the chat, on the Utah Sandbox, utah.sandbox.gov, it's in the chat website, or you can sign up at the very bottom of the page to get updates, including future events. So we have a question from David who says, you know, the focus of the Sandbox seems to be about streamlining and legal services, but he's suggesting that the challenges and opportunities that you've described, Dr. Sandefur, are speaking more to a lack of awareness about sort of pre-service need problems. And so he's wondering, is there sort of a plan for that? Is the Sandbox, is the Office of Innovation and Legal Services going to do anything about that? What are your thoughts?
So the Office of Legal Services Innovation just receives ideas, right? It receives people's models to do stuff. And the logic of it is you create a space where people can do stuff that we can't imagine, and then they come in and do it. People who are closer to the problems that their service populations experience than some central authority. And so people who can design better solutions. To your point about a lack of awareness of connecting the problem to law, I'm gonna hopefully show a range of ways that different people and organizations have worked on that, that do bring people into getting legal services when they need them. And the Sandbox, because it allows relaxations on UPL and on alternative business structures, creates some spaces to do those more assertively and more creatively than you can do them under the rules that govern the practice of law in most, I guess, every other state right now.
David, and anyone else who's asked a question, I should remind you guys, you're welcome to speak up and ask follow-up questions verbally if you'd like to. We don't have to just go through the chat. So if anybody wants to be bold and unmute yourself, cast aside the Zoom veil of muteness. Going once, going twice. I know you want to do it, Ben. I knew it.
I was going to say, I'll pipe up. I just wanted to say thanks, Dr. Sandefur, for your answer. I was the one who asked the question about whether lawyers are more useless than expensive. And I really appreciated your answer that it's neither, people just don't think about them. That answer totally reminds me of what dating was like in high school. People, it's not like people have a bad impression, they just don't have an impression. But I think you do, I think that's a valuable point that, and you've written about this before, that people just don't recognize their problems as legal problems. And I don't have anything nearly as intelligent to say about that as you do, but I just wanted to say thanks. I appreciated that.
Thank you.
And I feel like I should tag as someone who knows Ben, because I think y'all will probably appreciate it. I think his comment was both substantive and also aimed at getting another laugh out of Dr. Sandefur, to be clear.
That is fair. I'll admit that.
Access to justice researchers have a sense of humor. All right, we've got another question here. So from James, and forgive me, given your name there, C. James, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. And you can unmute yourself and speak if you'd like to, or I can read your question. So the question is, in the US, the concept of attorney at law encompasses both transactional and courtroom sort of litigation work that are sort of fused together, right? We get, as Dr. Sandefur likes to say, you get stamped on the forehead after law school and you can go out and litigate and do mergers and acquisitions and all of that stuff. And so James is asking about, is there something here about splitting legal certification into sort of different buckets that might be of use, and might you want to see something like that in the Sandbox, you know, a transactional practice, a litigation practice?
The interesting thing about a litigation practice is the Sandbox can allow an entity to practice law, but it can't make the court allow that person to appear, have a right to appear. And so a small claims court is a place maybe where perhaps people who are not lawyers could be representing clients. There are a range of federal tribunals, unemployment, Social Security, different kinds of benefits where people who are not lawyers, immigration, people who are not lawyers can already represent. It will be interesting to see how the court thinks about this moving forward. I think it will be interesting to see what models these entities develop, because as I said a minute ago, we're just sort of sitting here waiting for y'all to come up with awesome stuff. And whether there will be this kind of separation between transactional work and litigation work. Right now, that separation is created by the fact that in most courts, most courts in the state, you've got to have a lawyer if you want to have advocacy. But I don't know, I think that may change over time. I think the LPPs, the new licensed paralegal, may be permitted certain rights of, they don't have them yet, do they? They can't speak in court yet, can they?
They can't yet speak in court.
Yeah,
No.
but they'll probably be able to eventually. And it'll be really interesting to see how that develops.
Okay, great. Unless anybody wants to jump in with a follow-up question, I think it's to you, Dr. Sandefur, to continue with your unpacking of the research.
Okay, so let's see here if I can get, there we go. Okay, so when you have these challenges of people not understanding the kind of problem that they have, they're not they're going to sources that maybe not get them to the kinds of help that they actually need. They want a lot of transparency and clarity about next steps. You can come up with a gimmicky little set of things that start with T to describe the body of services and interventions that seem to be effective at making that connection for people. So like we talked about before, the whatever you offer, if it's a product, if it's a service, if it's an advertisement, it's targeted to the problem that the person faces. It's not, let me tell you, it's not a guide to landlord-tenant law. It's an intervention that focuses on the specific problem you have, which is that there are rats running around in your apartment or whatever that might be. It's timely, so it shows up at a time when you realize you need help. And there are lots of different points in the evolution of a situation where this is true, but you want to catch people at one of them, ideally an early one before things escalate. It's trustworthy, so it comes through some source that people believe means well by them or is honest in its brokering of access to different kinds of support, and it's transparent. And people want to know they want clear information about what can happen and how much it's going to cost. And so I would just want to talk about some already really existing examples of this. And those of you who may be thinking about coming into the Sandbox, that would be these kinds of things on steroids, among other ideas that you have out there. So one thing that seems to be effective is being problem focused and going where people already are. So this is a beer coaster from Montana. So the statewide legal aid office in Montana made a series of these cardboard beer mats that have a question about a justice problem on the front, and then the answer on the back, and a link that you can go to for help. So this is if you have a debt issue that's related to a divorce. And they took these and they distributed them around the state to bars, because people in Montana spend a lot of time in bars, and so that's a great way to connect with your service population. So there's one about debt, there's one about the terms of a lease, and then there's another one about being evicted for doing something threatening to a neighbor while your mental illness is not under control, right? So it identifies a specific situation you may have. It gives you a really short answer about what can happen, and then it tells you where to go for help. So this is a classic example of a relatively inexpensive and widely distributed problem-focused intervention. A PSA, a public service announcement, is another kind of thing like this. So New York City is trying to keep housing affordable by retaining people in their apartments. And so they have a whole series of signs and billboards and ads around the city that essentially give totally focused legal advice, right? So they say, is this the situation that you're having? Is the landlord asking for 3 months rent, which is a norm? If your landlord says that, you tell them this. Here's my legal advice, says the sign or the billboard. Security deposits can only be 1 month's rent, right? So a very focused thing that's meant to help people resolve a problem around access to housing. Another example would be from a tech platform. So this is also from New York City. This is a program called Just Fix. And if you go to their website, it says, do you want to request repairs to your apartment? It doesn't say, let's talk about the implied warranty of habitability or municipal housing codes or any of these other things. And then you go to this really cool tool that you can download on your phone, where it asks you an inventory of things that could be wrong in the common spaces in your private space. And then it says, okay, you told me there were rats, go take a picture of a rat. You told me there was a leak, go take a picture of the leak. And then you press done, and it writes a really nice letter to your landlord that attaches date stamped, time stamped, geocoded photos from your phone, and then it ships it off by certified mail. And so you've now started, if you're going to ever have a lawsuit, you've done the first thing that you have to do, but maybe you'll just get it fixed, right? Because you've done this very authoritative thing. But it all starts. It takes a legal action, a pretty complex one, just by saying, you know, you want to fix this problem of the repairs in your apartment. So that seems to be an effective way to connect with people. The second strategy that seems to work is embedding outreach or service where people are already going for some other reason. And you see this with general populations. You also see it with special populations that may have complex and overlapping needs. So if you're in a city, particularly in the Western United States, where it's pretty temperate, those cities can have large populations of homeless people because you can live there if you have to be outside a lot of the time. But of course, part of being homeless is not having access to things like sanitation and a place to put your stuff and be safe during the day and so on. And libraries become a place where this population gets access to water and bathrooms and things like that. So that's where this population already is. So librarians work with legal aid lawyers and pro bono lawyers and social workers to identify people who are hanging out in the library and connect them with transitional housing, access to benefits, things that will help them not be homeless anymore. So that's one sort of example of this sort of, you embed the solution where the people with the problem happen to be hanging out. Another example that's sort of growing in popularity around the world is a medical legal partnership, which in the UK and Australia is called a health justice partnership. So people are already going to doctors and community health clinics and hospitals with health issues that are caused by justice problems. So you put the lawyers there with the doctors. And the classic example would be asthma. So there are lots of kids, particularly in urban areas in the United States, who have asthma. And asthma is exacerbated by, I'm just gonna be frank, cockroach feces. And cockroach feces are the result of a pest infestation, which is in violation of most housing codes in the country. And so if you want to solve the medical problem of asthma, you often have to solve the legal problem of compliance with the housing code. And so the doctor gives you the medication and tells you these different things, and then the lawyer writes the letter to the landlord and says, hey, I'm a lawyer. You know, you have to fix this problem. And if the landlord doesn't fix it, then you keep moving. So that's another example of embedding, you know, organizing around the problem. It's problem focused, it's solving the asthma, but embedding the legal service with the other service that somebody's already going to. This is an organization that's in New York City. It's called Legal Hand. And where this embeds is in your neighborhood. So it's a storefront legal information service. This sign's a little bit hard to read, but it says things like, you know, is this crazy stuff happening to you? Come in. We can help you understand that scary letter that you got from your landlord. We can help you understand this notice of the termination of your utilities and what you can do about it. And they're in different neighborhoods around the city, and they become places where people go hang out and then tell each other, there's some really super helpful people here. You can come on in. It's a project of the Center for Court Innovation. So that's another way to do it, is to put it sort of where people are, when they're on their way to the train, when they're on their way to get lunch and so on, they'll run into it. One thing that we know, if you look at those survey data, the detailed survey data about those third parties that people go to when they're in trouble, when people are in trouble, they often go to sources of ultimate solace, like their faith. So they go to their pastor, they go to their priest, they go to their bishop, they go to their imam. And in Tennessee, they put together this thing that they call the Faith and Justice Alliance. Some other states are picking this up. But the idea is that church secretaries and people at the front line of religious organizations are also at the front line of legal services, in a sense. And so you train those folks to issue spot a little bit and to make referrals. So for example, if someone goes in and says to their priest, you know, Father, I'm really worried because my husband just gets so angry and I'm afraid of him. The priest will have a religious answer to that, but the priest might also say, you know, it sounds to me maybe you could benefit from connecting with this domestic violence organization, or maybe this legal aid organization. Maybe this is something you could think about in a range of ways. So that's another way of embedding access to help. You're not putting the lawyer there, but you're putting the connection to the lawyer there where people are already going when they're in trouble. Now, once you enter Sandbox land, you can do what happens in the United Kingdom. So this is a picture of a grocery store called the Co-op. It's all around the main island, and the Co-op sells legal services through Co-op Legal Services. And it also is the largest provider of funeral services in the country, and it cross-sells between funeral services and other kinds of end of life and probate and so on issues that its customers have. So again, this is a place they were already going for end of life issues, for milk and bread, and now you can also go there for legal services. So it's a different kind of embedding that's made possible by different kinds of rules about how legal services can be produced and where. Then there are examples of transparency, and transparency isn't just about good client care. It actually seems to empower people to take better action. So one example of this would be from a study that came out of the Access to Justice Lab at Harvard. So those of you who are follow consumer debt issues know that consumer debt actions are an enormous portion of dockets around the country. I think in Utah it's around 62% of civil cases are consumer debt actions, and rates of default are really high, so 75% to 95%, and then you just get a default judgment for whatever the debt buyer usually is claiming. So this intervention was trying to find ways to help people understand how they could respond and take action to respond. So they came up with cartoons. So the cartoon doesn't look like anybody. It's sort of a generic person. You don't have to identify with it. It tells you to do really straightforward things. Fill out 3 copies, mail 2 of them, keep 1. There's a set of these mailings that you get, and they start when this lab goes to the docket and pulls the cases that have been filed and sends everyone a direct mailing. So this intervention doubles the rate at which people file answers to the debt lawsuit, which is the first step in having any kind of defense. And it about halves the rate at which people default. So it doubles the rate at which they show up. It's not super complicated, but it's very direct and very clear. And it really does seem to change people's behavior when they confront this particular justice issue. So transparency about what to do and when to do it can be really valuable. And of course, then there's transparency about cost. One way to do this is to do upfront quotes to produce legal products rather than legal services. So this is the Co-op Legal Services website. You go to them, you tell them what your problem is. They say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is how much it's going to cost. And this is how much it's going to cost if it takes us 10 hours or if it takes us 2 hours. But now you know. You can also, of course, just charge for the product. So this is Rocket Lawyer's website. These documents are $40 a piece. This amount of time getting legal advice about this document from an attorney is this amount of money. It's very, very clear exactly what you're going to be paying and what you'll be getting for what you have. So there are a range of different ways to provide that transparency to people that makes it more comfortable for them to act because they know what to do and what's going to happen. And so if you think about these aspects of effective intervention, so they show up when you know you're in trouble, they're targeted to the problem as you understand it, they come through some mechanism that you believe means well by you, and they're clear about what's going to happen. This sort of boils down to thinking like the people that you want to help and going where those people already are, where they already are when they're in trouble. And for sometimes it's their home, and sometimes it's church, and sometimes it's the grocery store. But sort of thinking about where those points of connection are really key. So those are my examples of different things that are possible, that are happening in the US now and could be possible in the Sandbox. Just to signpost something, there are evidence sources and there are also resources that might be valuable to you. And if anyone wants those, if you write the Sandbox or me, I'll be happy to make sure that you get them. So thank you.
Does anybody want to speak up with a human voice with questions or post it in the chat? Have you learned everything you need to know about legal services and how to give clients access. Okay. Dr. Sandefur, anything else you think you want to close with, that you think you want to share with this group?
I really hope that those of you who are thinking about entering the sandbox will enter the sandbox with your creative ideas about how to increase ordinary people's access to justice, how to revolutionize the practice of law, and access to, I mean, this is everybody's justice system. And so we've got to find ways to make it possible for people to use that and enjoy the protections and live out the responsibilities that we give them. And so I really hope that this has given you some incentive, or at least excitement or interest in pursuing that. And I hope that you'll look forward to, there'll be future events like this. I think we have one planned on bias and artificial intelligence, so it'll be coming up soon, and we'll definitely have one about how to apply and how the application process works and so on.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Sandefur. We can maybe give her a silent, Zoomy, flat session. Just, we gotta go peak 2020 to close this out, right? All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a wonderful afternoon.